Well, hello everyone. It's great to have you here joining us for Tableau Trick or Treat. I don't know about where you live, but where I am, the air has gotten cool outside. The trees have started to change color, and the leaves are falling everywhere. It's actually my favorite time of the year, and for my kids, they are excited to dress up and go take candy from everyone around the neighborhood. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at Tableau and we're going to say trick or treat. And that is, we're going to show a few tricks and also a few treats when it comes to Tableau, designing dashboards, building visualizations, working with data. You're in for a treat. Hopefully you enjoy it. So we're excited. We're happy to be hosted by Technion Data Solutions, where both Bridget and I are consultants. We love working for clients, and we also love doing these webinars for you. So I am Joshua Milligan, and I am joined by Bridget Cogley, who is a fellow Zen master, and she is a dashboard designer extraordinaire. We'll start off with some tricks and treats from Bridget. So Bridget, thank you.
All right, thank you. And so probably the first thing to talk about, and I'll go ahead and make myself presenter here, so would be dashboard actions. And I would say in some ways these aren't used enough. Probably some of my favorite things to do, and I didn't even realize it at first, would be the hover action. I'm not sure how many people use that, but it's a great way to very quickly get insight about your data to where you can just hover on information and say, okay, what's going on with this data? And so, for example, in this one, I've actually got to where I've got the action on just the worksheet. So I've gone through dashboard and I've said, okay, on hover, just show me this information. And so that's just strictly from sheet 3 to sheet 3. At some point, I'll go through and name my sheets properly, but obviously not right at this second. So that's kind of a quick way to where it's a very powerful feature, and I can see kind of across my information. Just a nice way to visualize and see what's going on. So moving on from a sheet example and into more of a dashboard example, I'm sure many of you have seen this dashboard at least once before. This is our Superstore logics. I've used this before in other webinars. And so, for example, this is another one that makes use of that hover. So you can see when I hover on one, it just kind of calls out the state. So this is a great way to take different charts and form a relationship between them. So just kind of saying subtly, hey, if you hover on this, it's also going to just show you that information. It's a nice, powerful feature. And again, dashboard actions. And you can see where I've tried to also use good naming as well. And so you can see this one I've named highlight. You can just see, okay, based on 1 and 2, hover all fields. So that's another just quick way to add some nice design flair. Moving beyond just these simple hover actions, the other thing that I've gotten into and I've kind of played with is the building of applications. And so just trying to find ways to make Tableau not necessarily feel like Tableau, but kind of have it transport you and feel more like an application to where you can kind of say, okay, I'm building this application. And you can see in this example, I'm able to click through and interact with this and have it kind of feel like an application. Now, I do have a really interesting bug here in that I've got to click on this back without logging a few times. So this is kind of an example of where I would want to spend a little bit more time working on my dashboard actions. Some of you may recognize this as never-ending navigation, and probably one of the best tricks to make this work is by using just one field. So I've actually got this UNF field, which is just a parameter for name. And what I'm doing with this is I'm just passing this so that way it resets all my other filters. So what I'd want to do is just go through and add that to other features there. And to see a really good example of this, I've got this dashboard here, which is the one I did for Iron Viz. And what this allows me to do is I can click on any of these. So this is kind of my story points without the story points. And again, this also uses that never-ending navigation. So if I click on actions, you can see again, trying to adhere to good naming. One of the things that you'll notice, everything is a filter, and it is set to run on a field named filter. And so if I actually take a quick look at that field, you will see that field is simply 1. And what that does is it just resets the filter every time. So I've got my never-ending navigation, that's a separate data source. And so everywhere I click on this dashboard, it's just going to navigate me with no lag. It's going to reset every time. So when I click on different items and navigate to different places, it's not going to have that lag or kind of that problem that we experienced before. I will kind of jump in and just warn that this is a great feature for kind of presentations and other things that don't necessarily have a high load. And using them for business dashboards, I personally tend to avoid too much of this because it does add a lot of load. And as you can see, if you don't administrate it properly, you can create kind of a not so grand experience for your end users. So that's kind of my one warning with that. And again, also using actions to kind of just show some different things. So I can actually put kind of a tutorial or an explanation. And then as I hover, I can actually use actions. So I've got a where it hides. So I've got a lot of that kind of exclude when I have no data selected. So when I unselect, it shows kind of my base level. And then when I reselect, I'm actually hiding one of my charts. So if I go into dashboard actions, again, you can see where this thing is pretty full. But if I just drop this down to, so my hover action, you can see that I'm activating it from my scatter plot. And then it's affecting kind of my info and everything. And then when it's not hovered on, it excludes. And then by default, I have another sheet underneath it. So you can use layering as well. The other piece is this is an image below. So if I go to layout, you can see where I've used an image to create a framework. And that allows me to then kind of put things on top of it and build a UI. So that's another cheat where if you're doing dashboards for business, you can use an image as a framework, kind of put that in the background and then put things on top of it. I've seen businesses where they've done a really cool illustration, you know, and put room for a title, put some of their logos and stuff. And then that way you've got room to just kind of throw on information. I've also seen people where they've style guided and said, okay, put stuff here. So that's another way. So as you're teaching Tableau throughout your organization, you can actually build tools to teach people how do you build a dashboard. So that's kind of another really quick look at just some ways to improve dashboard building very, very simply, just with an image. So then kind of a final trick that I want to show is legends. We've got this very basic Tableau legend, so you can see it's square, but you'll notice everything else on this dashboard is round. And so for me, it doesn't feel like a good blend. So what I typically do with this is I will actually go ahead and get rid of this legend, and you can see here I have what I consider a fancier, nicer legend. And so I've got circles, and I can hover over this. It acts and looks like a legend, but it's actually a chart using index. And so if I just go ahead and show this, oops, you can see where I've got 1, 2, and then I went ahead and fixed my axis, so I've got this to 4, just to get this spaced out how I want. And then that way I was able to make this a circle and then put this over on my dashboard as a legend. So that's kind of a nice way of, well, I want Tableau to consolidate either shape or these different things that I've got encoded. You can really just make a chart. I actually just kind of threw this together pretty quickly. And so it's a nice way to have a simple, elegant touch to your dashboard. The final piece is I will use a lot of text. So I've got, this is a text box, this is a text box. With 10.4, I will go ahead and warn you, you do not come here and go to format text object anymore. You'll notice some pieces are missing. Instead, you go into layout. So you've got dashboard and layout, and you want to change your items here. So you can change your borders here. You can change your background. You can also add padding, so that way you get your text all nicely placed. And then if you want to add any additional layers, you can also just kind of throw on text boxes and just get them nicely placed. And it just adds a nice little finishing touch. So that's kind of my real quick run through of just some different tricks and treats that you can put on your dashboard. So you can see kind of the difference that it makes. Kind of here's kind of a solid, and versus just with a little border to make it pop. Okay. Joshua, do you want to do a run through of your tips?
All right, thank you, Bridget. Yeah, absolutely. So what I've got here is I've got Tableau up, and I've got just a simple data set that would allow me to see my sales of pumpkin spice latte nationwide. So I can see it by state or by zip code, potentially even break it down by region. Nothing too exciting, but you'll often have data sets like this where you want to show things maybe by state. So if I look at state, and I'll just bring my pumpkin spice latte sales out here and take a look. I've even got a nice color palette that maybe looks like pumpkin spice. And often you'll get a map that looks something like this. If you're looking at it as a filled map, some people call them choropleth maps, you'll get something like this. Now, I like it. It looks good aesthetically. It's nice, but there are some issues when you look at a filled map like this. And especially if you have Alaska and Hawaii in the view, the scale of the map all of a sudden starts to distort the story a little bit. I mean, even looking at this, it's a little bit hard to tell. Does Alaska or California have the most sales? I can hover and I can see the sales, 184,000 in Alaska, 190,000 in California. But imagine if Rhode Island were even higher, but I wouldn't have even seen it because it's so small on this map. And so that's one of the issues with a filled map. So one of the things that recently I've been introduced to, I started to see them used more and more in Tableau Public, and then I decided I would even try it out, is something called a hex map. And so what is a hex map? Well, we'll actually build one, and you'll see what it is. But a hex map is a way of looking at locations using a hex grid, so that everything is the same size, so that size doesn't distort the story. Now, the great thing is that it's very easy to create a hex map. In fact, if you just do a Google search for Tableau hex map, you'll find multiple blog posts, multiple resources, and the very first one, in fact, is a great blog post here on Tableau's website by Kevin Taylor. It's actually borrowed in large part from an original blog post by Matt Chambers, and so it's credited here. You can look at that initial blog post and see what all is going on there. Now, it describes a lot about making it and about all the different things here. All I really want here is I'm just going to grab the data set. So it does require knowing the X and Y locations of the hexes that I'm going to plot on there. But if I just download that, then I'll get a nice data set like this. It's got row, column, state, and abbreviation, all of which is very nice. I'm just going to copy that and then paste it into Tableau. So I'll come back to Tableau, Control V to paste, which is a nice trick that I didn't know for a while, that you could just paste data right into Tableau. There's the data set, and now I can actually blend these data sets together to get what I need. So instead of latitude and longitude, which Tableau nicely gives me, but instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to my pasted data source here and use row and column. So row on row, column on column. The interesting thing about this data set is that if I look at it, it's upside down. But that's not a problem because I can reverse an axis by right-clicking it, editing, and saying reversed. Now I've got the orientation right. I can clean up the formatting a little bit, so maybe not show the headers here. Maybe go into format and take some of these grid lines away, 0 lines away. We don't need to see any of that. And even now, you can kind of see what we're getting at, but these are circles and not hexes. So the question is how do I turn these into hexes? Well, I've got it on shape, and shape would allow me to choose all different kinds of shapes, but there's not a hex shape built in. So here's a nice little trick. You can add your own custom shapes to Tableau. And for the hex, you could go online, you could search for someone who's created a hex image, or you can create your own fairly easily. If you have Microsoft Office, just open up PowerPoint, and you can insert a custom shape, a hexagon, which shows up right here. So there's my hexagon. I can draw it. I'll try to get it roughly equal on all sides. And then I'm just going to rotate it so that the orientation is like this. Right-click it, say Save as Picture, and where do I put my my Tableau shapes? Well, I put them in my Tableau repository, Shapes folder, and then I'll select either an existing folder or create a new one. Each one of these is a palette of shapes, so probably I don't want to change an existing one, but I do have a custom folder that I've created, and I have a nice pumpkin image in there, but we'll do a hex shape now. Save it. We don't need PowerPoint anymore, but now if I come back to Tableau, click on Shape, More Shapes. Here are all of those palettes that we saw which were sub directories in that shapes directory. So arrows, bars, etc. Custom is here. It's got the pumpkin. I'm going to have to click on reload shapes to get the hex shape to show up. So there it is. Click it. I'll hit apply just to make sure. It looks like it got the pumpkin instead. There's a little bit of an issue there. So I'm going to have to hit apply twice, but now I've got the hexes the way that I want, and I can adjust the size, and now it's starting to look like a nice hex map. When I go to put this on a dashboard, I may have to adjust the size even a little bit more. You can see they start to overlap if you get too big. So I'm going to try something like this at first, and then when I get it on the dashboard, I'll see how it's doing. I might even take the abbreviation that was in that data set, put that on label, and then change the alignment maybe to get it right in the middle of that hex shape. So clicking on label there brings up a nice menu, and I have an alignment. I can put it in the center and the middle, and I'll make sure to check allow labels to overlap other marks, because I do actually want it to overlap the hex shape, and it might start to think that it can't do that. But that's no problem if it does that. I might adjust a few other things here, maybe change the font, make it bold, change the color if needed. Lots of different options. But now I have a nice hex map, and now if I go put that on a dashboard, and maybe even float it out there, now you can see how the sizing might change a little bit, but I can work on that a little bit. Now I've got a nice hex map. Alaska all of a sudden isn't 5 times bigger than all the other states. If Hawaii was out there, it would be nicely arranged. Washington, D.C. is easy to find, and small states like Rhode Island now are easily comparable to surrounding states and even farther away states. Everything's the same size, so now size doesn't distort the visual information. Now I can reliably look at the color. I still may have a little bit of difficulty differentiating the exact shades of the color, but it's a lot easier than if everything's a different size at the same time. And then I can decide how I want to use this. A hex map actually, I think, turns into a very, very nice input mechanism. So you could have actions that would drive other visualizations on the dashboard, and it could work out really well. So I'm really enjoying hex maps. I think I'm going to start using them quite a bit more now than I'd ever considered doing in the past. Definitely something to consider when you're trying to show geographic information. But another thing that that I had been wondering about doing is if I go back to the idea of a filled map. So if I have my states and I have it filled, one thing that I've always wanted to be able to do is to allow the user to switch between geographic levels of detail. So maybe they're looking at state and I want them to be able to switch to looking at zip code. So I can do that easily as a dashboard author. I can drop zip code in there and look at everything by zip code. That works really well, but that requires that I have the ability to drag and drop fields. I can take away fields. But if I were to publish this as a dashboard, how could I get them to be able to change the geographic level of detail on the dashboard? Well, I've seen a couple of different techniques. One possibility is to create multiple sheets and then kind of swap them in and out. That works okay, but that's kind of tedious if you have lots of different levels of detail. You'd have to create lots of different sheets. And then there are some other complications that can arise. So I was trying to figure out how to do this. And it never used to be possible, at least I never figured out a way, until Tableau allowed me to have custom shape files. So with the spatial files, now what I can do is I can bring those in as part of my data source. So I'm going to edit this data source here, and I'm going to add some shape files or some spatial files. So here's spatial file. Yeah, so I've got states. There's a list of states as of 2017. And if I bring that in and then join, using that cross-database join feature, here I'm going to join state, and in this data source it's called name. Then now I'm going to have a geometry field for every state. So over here I've got this geometry field, and it's a polygon that defines the shape of that state. But I can additionally then bring in another spatial file that is my list of zip codes. So here's my zip code shape file. And here I'll join zip code from sales. This one gets a little bit interesting because I have to make sure that the data types match. Even when I select the fields, it still says that there's a mismatch in type. So I'm going to actually have to create a join calculation to tell it to treat this as an integer. And if I do that, then we should get the join to work just fine. So definitely a little bit of setup here, and even a little bit more because I'm going to go back to my sheet. And now, instead of using state or zip code, now that I've got these other data sources, I have these geometries. And you can see if I clear out the sheet, if I use the geometry from the state, then Tableau will draw that geometry. If I use the geometry from the zip code, Tableau will additionally draw that geometry from the zip code. Now what's interesting is that Tableau will draw that as a single mark until I split it up. So we'll see here, once Tableau renders all of these different zip codes, that Tableau is treating this as a collection. The geometry field is a collection. This is a rather large file, so it takes Tableau a little bit longer here to compute the layout. I'm going to go ahead and cancel it. And just to help, let's filter to just the northeast region. That may help us be a little bit more efficient with this data set. Now, if I were to use state or zip code, I might think, well, I could create a calculated field and a parameter that would allow me to select that geographic level of detail. And I can create the parameter, no problem. Could have a list that said, you can choose either state or you can choose zip, and that's easy enough to do. And I might think, well, let's create a calculated field based on those two fields, the state or the zip. So here I'll call this my geographic field, and I would say, well, if the parameter is state, then we'll do state, and otherwise we'll do zip. And have to change that one to a string. And so now I've got a new field called geographic field, and based on my parameter selection, it would come up with the right value. The problem that I've always run into, though, is that I can define a geographic role, but I have to choose only one. So I could choose zip code, or I could choose state, or I could choose any of these others, but I can only choose one at a time. So it doesn't help to have two different fields and a parameter unless those two different fields are geometry fields, because Tableau doesn't care about the geometry in terms of the geographic role. It just cares that it can draw the shape. So I'm going to rename these just to make them a little bit more clear what they are. But state geometry and zip code geometry. And now I'm going to come back to my calculated field, and instead of using the state or zip, if I use those geometry fields, so state geometry here, and zip code geometry here, that works really well, because now I've got this geographic field that will draw based on what I want, so either state or zip. And now I've got a single view where I can switch between the two. But I do have one other issue, and that is Tableau is drawing this all as one mark until I slice it up using some kind of a field. So I need one more field that actually tells Tableau how to slice it up. So I'm going to duplicate this field. And here, instead of choosing the geometry, what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose the name for the state and that funny ZCTA field for the zip. That will just tell it which one's which. That's my geographic ID. And if I place that out in the view, now it slices up each one very nicely. So I can build out the view even more. I can take my pumpkin spice latte sales, put that on color. Let's make it orange. And maybe even adjust the color a little bit more to take the border away for the states. That looks great. When I get down to the county level, or the zip code level, it actually may look nicer if there aren't any borders. So Tableau will now render each zip code independently, and I can start to see that there were states that looked like they had lots of sales, and in fact they do, but those sales occur in just maybe a few zip codes. So New York, for example, a state that got a very dark orange color because of high sales, but if I look at the zip codes, it turns out that those zip codes with the high sales are just in a few areas, and this is really nice to have a single view now where I can switch back and forth between which level of detail right there in the same view, not having to switch sheets and not having to worry about anything else. So that's one treat, one trick that I'm working on in Tableau. I've just barely scratched the surface of what you could do with these custom shapefiles. I think there's a lot more that could be done, but I'm excited to figure out more going forward. And I'll leave you with one final treat. So Tableau announced at the conference that Tableau 10.5 is in beta. So with Tableau 10.5, I'm going to bring that over here. One treat that I'm really enjoying, two treats actually. One is Hyper, which makes everything incredibly fast. The other is the idea of having Viz-in-tooltip. So before, I may have had a view like we were just looking at, maybe the states, maybe the sales by state, and that's great, but I know that I'm selling out of three major categories. So I know I'm selling furniture and technology and office supplies. How do I show that on a map? Well, I've seen people put pie charts on a map, and that kind of works. I'm not too fond of that. That's not great. I can definitely get the total sales, but I really before didn't have a lot of good ways of showing each one of those categories per state. Now I could have built another view, so I could have my categories, and I could have my sales, so that I could see it. I could sort it, and that would kind of work. But I might have to put those on the same dashboard in order to see them together, put some actions around it, and I could definitely do that. But I'm loving the idea that in Tableau 10.5, I can have a visualization in my tooltip. So I come here to tooltip, and I could make this look really nice. So we have our country, we have our state, we have the sales. We could make the font really nice. Maybe take away the command buttons. But this is the treat that I'm enjoying. Insert sheets, and my sheet 2, which I probably should give a nicer name to, but for now, sheet 2. And you can see Tableau inserts a bunch of different options there that you could play around with, but I'm just going to leave it the way it is and say OK. And now, when I hover over a state, now I can see exactly which categories had how much sales. And it's a great way to have an interactive visualization or a dashboard that allows me to see even more data as I interact with it. And you can imagine all kinds of things you can do here. Here I've put in a bar chart to slice up the different categories. You could look at timelines. You could look at details of cities within the state, all kinds of things that you could do with this Viz-in-tooltip. And so a great treat to leave you looking forward to, as 10.5 is now in beta and will soon hopefully be in production.